Just moments after baby Truc Lam finally fell asleep, Dad Trieu Duong froze at the doorway. A long trail of ants was quietly crawling straight into the house. What seemed like a small problem quickly turned serious when he realized they were heading toward the very place where his daughter sleeps and plays. For Trieu Duong, even the smallest danger was something he couldn't ignore. Without making a sound, he began to act, cleaning every inch of the ground, sealing the gaps, and preparing a simple but determined barrier to protect her peaceful space. But can he really stop them completely? Or will they find a way back when he least expects it? If this story touches your heart, please leave a comment and let us know. The afternoon light softened as it slipped through the small wooden doorway, casting long golden lines across the floor. Inside the quiet home, Dad Trieu Duong moved gently, almost instinctively, slowing his steps as he looked toward the bed. Baby Truc Lam had just fallen asleep. A few moments earlier, she had been nestled in his arms, her tiny fingers loosely gripping his shirt as she finished her milk. He had held her close, one hand supporting her back, the other softly patting her until she let out a small, sleepy sigh. It was a sound he had come to treasure, proof that she was full, safe, and content. Now she lay on the bed, wrapped carefully in a thin, clean blanket. Her breathing was steady, her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Trieu Duong stood beside her for a moment longer than necessary, watching. His eyes didn't just look, they guarded. Every small movement, every breath, he followed like it was the most important thing in the world. He adjusted the edge of the blanket slightly, making sure it didn't cover her face. His fingers lingered for a second on her shoulder, as if silently promising, "I'm right here." Only after he was sure she was completely asleep did he slowly step away. Outside, the air felt warmer. The faint sounds of the countryside returned. The distant rustle of leaves, a bird calling from somewhere far away. It was quiet but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that made a father listen even more carefully. Trieu Duong stretched his back slightly, rolling his shoulders after holding her for so long. A small smile crossed his face. Moments like that, feeding her, holding her, watching her fall asleep. Those were the moments that made everything else worth it. He turned toward the doorway, planning to tidy up a few things before she woke again. But then, he paused. Something on the ground caught his attention. At first, it was just a thin, dark line near the edge of the doorway. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely, but Trieu Duong's eyes narrowed as he leaned down slightly. It moved, a line of ants. Not just a few scattered ones, but a steady stream, one after another, moving in perfect order. They were coming from outside, slipping through a small gap near the doorframe, and heading inside. His expression changed immediately. The softness in his eyes was replaced with alertness. He crouched down, bringing his face closer to the ground. The ants were carrying tiny fragments, food, dirt, something from outside, and marching with purpose. Their path led straight inward, straight toward the house, straight toward where Truc Lam slept. Trieu Duong's jaw tightened. For a brief second, he imagined it. Ants crawling across the floor, reaching the bed, climbing onto the blanket, onto her soft skin. No! He stood up quickly, his movements still controlled, but now filled with urgency. He glanced back inside. Truc Lam was still asleep, peaceful, unaware, and that made it even more serious. "She can't be anywhere near this," he muttered quietly under his breath. Without wasting another second, he stepped outside and grabbed a broom leaning against the wall. The wooden handle was worn from use, but firm in his grip. He returned to the doorway and began sweeping, slow at first, careful not to scatter them deeper into the house. He swept outward, pushing the ants back toward where they came from. The dry bristles brushed against the ground in steady strokes, breaking their line, disrupting their path. But the ants didn't disappear. They scattered, then quickly regrouped, still moving, still coming. Trieu Duong frowned. "They're not stopping." He leaned down again, following their trail with his eyes. The line extended farther than he expected, stretching beyond the doorway and disappearing along the outer wall of the house. This wasn't just a few ants. This was a trail, a route, which meant there was a source, and if he didn't stop it completely, they would keep coming back. He tightened his grip on the broom. "Not near my daughter," he said quietly, more firmly this time. He began sweeping more thoroughly now, clearing not just the doorway, but the surrounding ground. Dust, small debris, dried leaves, everything was pushed away. He cleared the space completely, exposing the bare earth underneath. The ants scattered again, but still some remained, still searching, still moving toward the same direction. Trieu Duong stood still for a moment, thinking. Sweeping alone wasn't enough. He needed something stronger, something that would stop them from coming back at all. He glanced toward the small outdoor cooking area. Near the corner, there was a pile of ash from previous fires, fine, gray, and dry. Beside it, a small sack of lime powder he had used before for cleaning and protection. His eyes lit up slightly. That could work. He moved quickly, but quietly, mindful of the sleeping child inside. He grabbed a small container and scooped some ash into it, then added a handful of lime powder. Returning to the doorway, he knelt down again. This time, his movements were more precise. He sprinkled a thin line of ash and lime across the entrance, right along the path where the ants had been entering. The powder spread evenly across the ground, forming a barrier, a quiet line of protection. He watched closely. The ants approached the edge, then hesitated. Some turned away. Some tried to cross, but slowed, disoriented. Trieu Duong didn't look relieved yet. He stayed there, watching carefully, studying their behavior like it truly mattered, because to him it did. Everything that could reach his daughter mattered. Everything that could harm her, even something as small as an ant, was something he would stand against. He added another layer of ash, reinforcing the barrier. Then another. His hands moved steadily, deliberately, creating a wider line this time, a stronger boundary. Behind him, inside the house, Truc Lam shifted slightly in her sleep. Trieu Duong immediately turned his head. His body froze. He listened. Her breathing remained steady. She didn't wake. He exhaled softly, but didn't relax completely. Not yet. Not until he was sure. He turned back to the ground, eyes sharp again. The ants were slowing down now. Their line was broken, their direction uncertain. But still, a few continued to search for a way through. Trieu Duong stared at them, his expression calm, but determined. "This has to stop completely," he said under his breath. Because for him, this wasn't just about cleaning. It wasn't just about insects. It was about protecting the small, fragile world of someone who depended entirely on him. And he wasn't going to let anything cross that line. Trieu Duong didn't move from the doorway. He stayed crouched low, one hand resting on the ground, eyes fixed on the thin line of ash and lime he had just created. To anyone else, it might have looked like a simple layer of powder, but to him, it was a boundary, a quiet promise that nothing harmful would pass through. The ants continued to approach in scattered groups, no longer in a strong, organized line. Some reached the barrier and paused, their tiny bodies shifting direction as if confused. Others attempted to cross, only to slow down and retreat. It was working, but not completely. A few still lingered, searching along the edges, as if trying to find even the smallest gap. Trieu Duong's gaze sharpened. He leaned closer, carefully studying the ground. That's when he noticed something he had missed before. A narrow crack along the bottom edge of the doorframe. Barely visible, but enough for something as small as an ant to slip through. That's where they're coming in. His voice was quiet, controlled. Without hesitation, he reached for more ash and lime, mixing it again with his hands before pressing it firmly into the crack. He didn't just sprinkle it this time. He packed it in, sealing the gap as best as he could. His fingers moved with patience on smoothing the surface, reinforcing every weak point. Because he knew, if there was even one opening, they would find it. When he finished, he sat back slightly, observing again. The ants reached the area, but this time there was no clear path forward. They hesitated longer, turned away faster. The movement that once felt like a steady invasion now looked broken, scattered, uncertain. Only then did Trieu Duong allow himself to breathe a little easier, but he didn't stand up yet. Instead, he turned his head once more, looking inside the house. Truc Lam was still sleeping. Her tiny hand had shifted slightly, resting near her cheek. The blanket remained in place, rising gently with each breath she took. So small, so unaware of everything happening just a few steps away. Trieu Duong's expression softened instantly. All the tension in his face eased, replaced by something deeper, something quieter. Care, protection, a kind of love that didn't need to be spoken. He wiped his hands lightly against his pants before standing up slowly. But instead of walking away, he stepped back, inside, and moved closer to her. He crouched beside the bed again. For a moment, he didn't do anything. He just watched. His eyes traced every detail, the softness of her hair, the calmness of her face, the way her body relaxed completely in sleep. He reached out gently, adjusting the blanket once more, making sure it stayed exactly where it should be. Then, almost without thinking, he placed his hand lightly beside her, not touching, just close enough to feel her warmth. "I won't let anything get near you," he whispered softly. His voice was barely audible, but the promise behind it was firm. Outside, the world continued as usual. The breeze moved through the trees. The light shifted slowly as the afternoon passed. But inside that small space, everything felt still. Safe. After a few moments, Trieu Duong stood up again and walked back toward the doorway. This time, his steps were quieter, more controlled. He picked up the broom once more and began sweeping the outer area again, this time going farther than before. He cleared along the wall, following the faint remnants of the ant trail to its source. It took him a few minutes, but eventually he found it, a small cluster near a pile of old debris, tucked close to the side of the house. Tiny movements, constant activity. That was where they had come from. Trieu Duong didn't hesitate. He cleared the debris first, lifting away dry leaves, broken pieces of wood, anything that could shelter them. Then he spread more ash and lime around the area, creating another barrier, this time at the source. His actions were steady, methodical, not rushed, because this wasn't something he wanted to fix temporarily. He wanted it gone, completely. As he worked, sweat began to form lightly on his forehead. The afternoon heat was still there, pressing down, but he didn't seem to notice. His focus stayed the same. Every movement had a purpose. Every step was for her. After finishing, he stood up straight and looked over everything one more time. The cleared ground, the sealed doorway, the reinforced barriers. The ants were no longer forming a line, no longer moving toward the house. The space felt quiet again, controlled. Only then did Trieu Duong finally lower the broom and rest it against the wall. He took a deep breath, not a tired breath, but a steady one. The kind that comes after making sure everything is as it should be. He turned and walked back inside once more. The light had shifted slightly now, softer, warmer. Truc Lam was still asleep, unbothered, protected. Trieu Duong sat down near the bed this time, leaning back slightly against the wooden wall. He didn't pick up any tools. He didn't start another task. He just stayed there, watching over her. Because for him, this quiet moment, this stillness, this simple act of being present was just as important as anything he could build or fix. Maybe more. His eyes remained on her, calm but always aware. Even now, after everything seemed under control, he didn't let his guard down completely. Because being a father, to him, wasn't something you paused. It was something you lived every second, every small decision, every quiet moment. Outside, the line of ants had disappeared. Inside, a small girl slept peacefully, wrapped not just in a blanket, but in something stronger, a kind of protection she couldn't see, but would always feel. And as the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, Trieu Duong remained there, silently watching, ready for whatever came next. Because no matter how small the threat, he would always be there first, between it and her. After gently feeding baby Truc Lam and putting her to sleep, Dad Trieu Duong notices a long trail of ants entering the house through the doorway. Realizing they could reach the place where his daughter sleeps and plays, he immediately becomes alert. Determined to protect her, he carefully sweeps the area, clearing dust and debris. But the ants keep coming back. Understanding that simple cleaning is not enough, he uses ash and lime to create a protective barrier and seals small gaps where the ants are entering. Step by step, he reinforces the area, even tracking the source outside the house to stop them completely. Once everything is secured, he returns inside, watching over his sleeping daughter, quietly ensuring that her small, peaceful world remains safe.